There is a question that haunted me for most of my life, and for nearly 2 decades, I stopped allowing myself to ask it. Not because I lost interest in it, not because science moved on to bigger problems. I stopped asking because every single time I came close to the answer, something inside me resisted. At first, I told myself that resistance was discipline. I called it scientific caution. I convinced myself it was the responsible instinct of a physicist who understood the limits of evidence and knew when speculation had gone too far. But looking back now, I realized that was not caution at all. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that appears when a question threatens the foundation of everything you built your life around. Because when you spend 50 years constructing a framework for understanding reality, you do not casually walk to the edge of that framework and wonder what exists beyond it. Most people stay safely inside the walls. They understand. I certainly did. But eventually, one question kept returning, no matter how much I tried to avoid it. Why is there something instead of nothing? And before you dismiss that as philosophy, before you decide this belongs in late-night conversations instead of serious science, let me tell you something important. I used to dismiss it exactly the same way. I treated it like an abstract puzzle with no practical value, something outside the proper boundaries of physics. But over time, I began to realize that the dismissal itself was the problem. It was convenient, yes. Comfortable, absolutely. But it was also deeply dishonest. Because avoiding difficult questions does not make them disappear. It only reveals the limits of what we are willing to confront. In physics, we use the word forbidden in a very specific way. A forbidden process is not something difficult or unlikely. It is something the structure of reality itself does not permit. A violation of a conservation law, a breakdown of symmetry, something the universe simply refuses to allow. For a very long time, the question of why existence exists at all was treated almost like that. Not officially, of course. Nobody wrote it into an equation and declared it illegal. But culturally, intellectually, the question was pushed outside the acceptable boundaries of physics. Scientists were expected to ask how the universe behaves, not why there is a universe in the first place. And I understand why. Because once you ask that question honestly, you immediately run into the limits of every framework we currently possess. General relativity describes space-time, but it assumes space-time already exists. Quantum mechanics describes probabilities and evolving states, but it begins with a system already there. The Standard Model explains particles and forces, but it never explains why there is a reality containing particles and forces to begin with. Every theory starts in the middle of the story. That realization changed something in me. Because I slowly understood that a question existing beyond the reach of our current methods does not make it meaningless. It may simply mean our methods are incomplete. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in scientific history happened because someone looked at an accepted boundary and asked a dangerous question. Why does this boundary exist at all? And eventually, someone crossed it. So I want to cross it carefully here, not recklessly, not pretending certainty where none exists, but honestly, because at this stage of my life, moving toward truth feels more important than protecting my reputation for precision. Let us begin with the one fact nobody can deny. The universe exists. That sounds obvious, almost childish in its simplicity. But it is actually the deepest mystery we know. Existence itself is the thing every scientific model quietly assumes without explaining. Some people argue the question itself is flawed. They say asking why the universe exists is like asking what lies north of the North Pole. According to that view, existence is simply the starting point. No explanation needed. I used to find that satisfying. I do not anymore. Not because I discovered a complete answer, because I have not, but because I realized that lacking an answer does not erase the legitimacy of the question. Something exists. Consciousness exists. Matter exists. Time exists. That fact deserves more than a shrug. And here is where modern physics becomes fascinating. Quantum mechanics has shown us that nothing is not as empty as common sense suggests. In quantum field theory, a vacuum is not truly empty space. It is active, fluctuating, filled with temporary particles appearing and disappearing constantly. What we call nothing is already full of structure and potential. That changes everything. Because one serious idea in cosmology suggests the universe itself may have emerged from a quantum fluctuation. In other words, existence may arise naturally, because absolute non-existence is unstable. Think about that carefully. Maybe something is not the strange outcome that requires explanation. Maybe something is what naturally happens. Now, of course, that does not fully solve the mystery. You can still ask where the laws of quantum mechanics came from. You can still ask why the vacuum exists at all. Those questions remain. But the shape of the problem changes. And when a difficult question changes shape, that matters. That is progress. But living with questions for long enough does something strange to a person. Eventually, they stop being purely scientific questions. They become mirrors. They reveal not only what you understand about the universe, but what you avoid understanding about yourself. And that realization changed me far more than any equation ever did. If this question about existence challenged my understanding of physics, it also forced me to confront something even more uncomfortable, the way I had spent much of my life avoiding certain truths entirely. The strange thing about living with a difficult question for many years is that eventually the question stops being theoretical. It stops sitting safely inside books, lectures, or equations. It begins pressing against your actual life, quietly at first, then more insistently. And if you do not ignore it completely, it starts revealing things about you that have nothing to do with science and everything to do with how you exist as a human being. That happened to me slowly. For most of my career, I believed I was someone committed to truth. And in many ways I was. Physics demands honesty. Equations do not care about your ego. Experimental data does not reward emotional comfort. Reality is stubborn, and science works because eventually you must submit your ideas to evidence whether you like the result or not. But over time, I realized there were entire areas of my life where I was not applying that same honesty. I had become extremely skilled at asking questions that could be answered through calculation, measurement, and theory. Questions with structure. Questions that behave properly inside the framework of physics. But there were other questions sitting quietly in the background. Questions I avoided because they did not fit neatly into equations. Questions about presence. Questions about attention. Questions about what my pursuit of understanding had cost the people closest to me. And the uncomfortable truth is that avoiding those questions became easier the longer I succeeded professionally. From the outside, it looked admirable, focused, disciplined, dedicated. The image of someone committed to meaningful work. But internally, something else was happening. I was staying in the areas where I felt competent. There is safety in questions that remain external to you. Physics problems may be difficult, but they do not judge you personally. The universe does not care if you misunderstand quantum gravity. Black holes do not suffer because your equations are incomplete. Reality remains emotionally indifferent to your mistakes. Human relationships are not like that. When you fail there, the consequences land on real people. And that changes everything. Because personal questions require a different kind of honesty. They force you to examine not only what you know, but who you are while knowing it. They ask whether you were truly present, whether your attention was genuine, whether the people who loved you actually felt seen by you. Those are harder questions than most scientific problems I have faced. Not intellectually harder, but emotionally harder. And I think many people avoid them for exactly that reason. There is a certain kind of avoidance that disguises itself as productivity. You convince yourself you are focused on important things. You tell yourself your work matters. And maybe it does, but slowly, without realizing it, you begin treating the measurable parts of life as the only parts that count. You illuminate one small area beneath the lamp and call it the entire world. I did that for years. And then something from physics itself forced me to see the problem differently. One of the most powerful ideas to emerge from modern physics is the principle that information is never truly destroyed. In quantum mechanics, information about every interaction remains encoded within the universe in some form. Even if it becomes practically unrecoverable, it is not erased. The universe keeps the record. Every event, every interaction, every state. That idea affected me much more deeply than I expected. Because once you truly absorb it, you begin realizing something unsettling. Every moment matters permanently. Every conversation where you were only half listening. Every dinner where part of your mind remained trapped inside work. Every moment you postpone genuine attention because something else seemed more urgent. None of it disappears. The universe records it all in its own cold and beautiful way. And I do not mean that mystically. I mean it physically. Time moves forward. Events happen once. Moments are real structures inside reality itself. They are not infinitely repeatable resources. That realization becomes heavier as you age. You begin noticing how many moments were spent somewhere else mentally while life itself was unfolding directly in front of you. I think about that often now, not with self-hatred. That accomplishes very little, but with clarity, because awareness matters. Recognizing where you were absent matters. Recognizing what was neglected matters. And eventually, every road in physics leads toward one unavoidable concept: entropy. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that disorder increases over time. Systems naturally drift toward higher entropy. The universe itself moves irreversibly forward. That is why time has direction. Why you remember yesterday but not tomorrow. Why causes come before effects. And on a human level, the meaning becomes painfully simple. You cannot reverse a moment once it passes. You cannot recover a conversation that never happened. You cannot magically undo years of emotional distance simply because you suddenly recognize it existed. Time does not move backward for anyone. Thermodynamics is merciless about that. But here's the part people often misunderstand. Increasing entropy does not mean meaningful structure cannot exist. It does not mean order is impossible. Quite the opposite. Local systems can become more organized through the deliberate investment of energy. That is true in physics. And I believe it is true in love. Because relationships are low entropy structures, they do not sustain themselves automatically. They require energy, attention, presence, maintenance. Without continuous effort, distance naturally increases. I understood entropy mathematically long before I understood it emotionally. That is one of the great ironies of my life. I could lecture for hours about thermodynamic systems, while quietly allowing important relationships to drift apart through neglect. Not dramatic neglect. Nothing obvious enough to attract immediate attention. Just the gradual accumulation of partial presence, and partial presence is still absence. That realization hurt when I finally admitted it to myself. Because I began seeing how often I was physically near people while mentally somewhere else entirely, already focused on the next problem, the next paper, the next task, always slightly ahead of the moment I was actually inside. And eventually I started asking myself a terrifying question. What if being impressive is not the same thing as being present? What if the people who love us do not need our brilliance nearly as much as they need our attention? That question changed the way I started understanding not only relationships, but consciousness itself. Because in quantum mechanics, observation is never passive. The observer changes the system being observed. Attention leaves a trace. Measurement alters reality. And I have come to believe human attention works similarly. When you truly give your attention to another person, not superficially, not while distracted, but fully, something changes in both of you. There is a concept in quantum mechanics that most people hear about in simplified form, usually reduced to strange examples about particles behaving differently when observed. But underneath those examples is something much deeper and far more unsettling. In quantum physics, observation is not passive. The observer is not separate from reality. The act of measuring something changes the thing being measured. That idea bothered me for years. Not because it was mathematically confusing. The mathematics are difficult, yes, but physicists eventually learn how to work with difficult mathematics. What stayed with me was the philosophical implication hiding beneath the equations. The realization that attention itself is an interaction. That observation leaves a trace. You cannot look at reality without participating in it. And eventually I started wondering whether that principle extends far beyond physics. Because I think human attention works the same way. When someone truly pays attention to you, you feel it immediately. Not performative attention, not the distracted version where someone nods while mentally elsewhere. Real attention, full presence. The kind where another conscious mind is completely there with you in the moment. Something changes when that happens. And the absence of it changes things too. I did not fully understand that for most of my life. I understood achievement. I understood discipline. I understood the satisfaction of solving problems that resisted everyone else for years. But presence is a different skill entirely. Presence requires you to stop treating life like a sequence of tasks and start recognizing that moments themselves are the thing you are living. That sounds obvious when spoken aloud. It did not feel obvious while I was busy becoming the person everyone admired professionally. Because success creates a dangerous illusion. It convinces you that competence in one area naturally transfers into wisdom everywhere else. You begin assuming that because you can analyze complex systems, you must also understand human ones. But human beings are not equations. Relationships are not solved once and then permanently complete. They require continuous attention, continuous energy, continuous participation. And physics itself already tells us why. Every system naturally drifts toward disorder, unless energy is invested to maintain structure. That is not pessimism, that is thermodynamics. A garden untended becomes overgrown. A building abandoned decays. A relationship neglected slowly fills with silence. Entropy is not dramatic most of the time. It is gradual. That is what makes it dangerous. You rarely notice the distance forming while it is happening. You notice afterward, when conversations feel thinner than they used to, when someone stops trying to explain themselves because they no longer believe you are fully listening, when emotional closeness becomes logistical coexistence. And by then, years may have passed. I think many people experience this without naming it directly. They continue functioning, continue succeeding, continue performing the role expected of them. But underneath, something essential has started thinning out. Attention, presence. The willingness to fully inhabit the moment you are inside instead of mentally escaping into the next one. I spent a long time living that way, always partially elsewhere. And the frightening part is that society often rewards it. We celebrate productivity, ambition, intellectual achievement. We admire people who appear constantly engaged with important work, but we rarely ask whether they are emotionally available to the people standing directly beside them. That question matters more than I once believed, because eventually I realized something painful. The people closest to us do not primarily experience us through our accomplishments. They experience us through our attention, through whether we are genuinely there, and attention is finite. That may be one of the most important truths physics ever taught me. Consciousness can only fully occupy one moment at a time. Every hour spent mentally somewhere else is an hour unavailable to the life unfolding directly in front of you. Time is not abstract. It is physical, irreversible. Once spent, it cannot be reclaimed. That realization becomes sharper as you age. You begin recognizing how many moments were treated as temporary when they were actually permanent. Conversations postponed, affection delayed, presence replaced with performance. And eventually, another idea from physics began haunting me in a completely personal way. The arrow of time. Entropy increases. Time moves forward. Causes become effects and never reverse themselves. You cannot return to earlier states exactly as they were. The universe does not offer rewinds. At first, that idea sounds depressing, but I do not think it is. I think it is clarifying, because once you truly understand the irreversibility of time, you begin seeing the present differently. You stop assuming there will always be another perfect opportunity to say what matters. Another perfect evening to reconnect. Another convenient future moment to become more emotionally honest. Maybe there will be. Maybe there will not. Physics offers no guarantees there. And strangely, that awareness made me appreciate consciousness itself far more deeply than I once did. Consciousness is extraordinary when you really examine it. Matter organized itself into systems capable of awareness, capable of reflection, capable of asking why existence exists at all. That is astonishing. The universe became able to observe itself through conscious minds. And what those minds choose to pay attention to may be the most important decision they ever make. Because attention shapes reality at every scale that matters to human life. Attention determines what grows, what survives, what deepens, what dissolves. Where attention goes, structure forms. Where it disappears, entropy takes over. I wish I had understood that earlier. I wish I had recognized that being emotionally present is not a secondary skill unrelated to intellectual life. It is part of the same responsibility. To truly observe reality includes observing the people around you honestly, not as background, not as supporting characters in your personal story, but as conscious beings carrying entire inner worlds invisible to everyone except those willing to truly pay attention. That realization changed how I understand love itself. Not romantically in the simplified way movies describe it. I mean physically, structurally. Love may simply be the deliberate investment of energy into maintaining meaningful human connection against the natural drift of entropy. A continuous act of choosing presence. And that choice becomes harder in a world constantly fragmenting our attention into smaller and smaller pieces. But the alternative is dangerous. Because eventually, if you avoid the deepest questions long enough, you wake up and realize you built a successful life while quietly neglecting the experience of actually living it. And that realization leads directly into the next question I had to confront, whether consciousness itself is not just part of reality, but the central feature of it. The more I studied physics, the more I began noticing something strange hiding beneath nearly every major question we ask about reality. No matter how deeply we investigate matter, space, time, gravity, or quantum mechanics, eventually we arrive at the same unavoidable fact. Every discovery is being experienced through consciousness. That sounds simple, but it is not. Consciousness is the one thing we use constantly while understanding almost nothing about it. We can measure brain activity. We can map neural patterns. We can observe electrical signals moving through biological systems. But none of that fully explains the actual experience of being aware. None of it explains why there is something it feels like to exist from the inside. And once I started taking that seriously, it changed the way I viewed nearly everything else. Because for most of modern scientific history, consciousness has been treated almost as a side effect, an accidental byproduct of complex chemistry. Matter organizes itself into brains, brains produce awareness, and eventually awareness disappears again when the system breaks apart. But I am no longer convinced that explanation is complete. Not because I reject science, quite the opposite. I think following science honestly forces us towards stranger conclusions than we are usually comfortable admitting. Consciousness may not simply be another object inside the universe. It may be the thing through which the entire universe becomes meaningful at all. Think about what physics actually does. Physics builds models describing relationships between observations. Every equation, every experiment, every theory ultimately depends on conscious beings perceiving patterns in reality. Without awareness, there is no science, no mathematics, no meaning, no understanding of existence whatsoever. Consciousness is not sitting outside the process. It is the center of it. And yet, for a very long time, I treated consciousness almost like an inconvenience, something secondary, something that would eventually be explained away once neuroscience advanced far enough. I do not believe that anymore. In fact, I think consciousness may be the deepest mystery we have ever encountered. More mysterious than black holes. More mysterious than quantum gravity. Because at least with black holes, we can point to physical equations describing their behavior. Consciousness is different. It is the thing doing the pointing, the thing asking the questions, the thing experiencing the universe directly. And that realization affected me personally in ways I did not expect. Because if consciousness is fundamental to reality in some deep sense, then attention becomes far more important than modern life usually treats it. Where you place your awareness shapes the structure of your existence itself. Most people spend their lives with fragmented attention, constant distraction, constant movement between tasks, screens, obligations, anxieties, plans, memories. Very little full presence anywhere. I lived that way too. And for years I justified it by telling myself I was pursuing important work, which was partly true, but eventually I had to confront another possibility. Maybe I was also using work to avoid vulnerability, avoid silence, avoid the discomfort of sitting fully inside my own life without distraction.